Under a ceiling of smoke-darkened beams, a small blue flame licks the neck of a glass retort, and the room trembles with the slow heartbeat of an oven that never sleeps, as if the night itself were being distilled into something denser and more lucid than dawn. Legends insist that in a place like this a powder once formed, a red ferment that could turn a base metal to noble gold, draw sickness out of flesh, and mend the fracture between the human and the divine. And it is in that hush that the first question opens like a door hinges on nothing. Because where does myth end if the laboratory never stops breathing? The Philosopher's Stone is not a stone so much as a promise wearing many disguises. Sometimes a translucent gem, sometimes a heavy scarlet mass, sometimes a tincture that stains and stains until everything becomes like itself. The old books call it the medicine of metals and men, a seed of perfection buried in the veins of the earth, and the universal key that turns locks on both matter and mind until nothing resists and everything resonates. And yet, in the margins of these claims, the ink hesitates and curls into symbols of birds and suns, as if the language itself took shelter behind a veil to survive another century of searching. Its earliest whispers rise from the dust of Alexandria, where Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern thought fused into the luminous ambiguity of Hermetic philosophy, suggesting a cosmos mirrored in all its parts, a symmetry so perfect that working on copper in a jar might be a way of working on the invisible structure of the sky. The brief tablet attributed to Hermes speaks not in instructions, but in patterns about what is above and below, about the marriage of fire and earth and the subtlety that conquers the heavy. And within those suggestions, the alchemist found permission to proceed as if the cosmos had left hints in the cracks of furnaces and urns. In the 3rd century, the Alexandrian writer Zosimos described procedures and visions in the same breath, naming apparatus and alloys, while recounting dreams of metal-bodied beings, crying out as they were boiled and reborn, a mingling of metallurgy and mysticism that reads like a ledger of laboratory steps, encrypted by images of sacrifice and renewal. He enumerated baths, grindings, distillations, and calcinations with a craftsman's patience. But his sudden turns into the depths of vision hint that the stuff of the stone might be as much an inner crystallization as the result of a patient dance of heat and time that leaves ash brighter than fire. The symbols assemble like a star map made of beasts. A lion devouring the sun, a king and queen entering a bath, a serpent that eats its own tail and survives by becoming what it consumes, and a sealed egg warmed by a secret fire until it hatches a bird that learns to carry metal on its wings. To the uninitiated, these are fables. To the initiated, they are diagrams of action and reaction remembered in images so ancient that laboratory glass seems young beside them. And in those images, the very recipe for the stone might hide as playfully as if mythology and chemistry had agreed to exchange masks. At the center of the room stands the furnace they call the athanor, a womb of regulated heat meant to imitate the patience of the earth, burning neither too bright nor too weak, feeding reactions that cannot bear the shock of haste. The craft demanded a clock built out of temperature and color, out of weeks and months measured by the hue of salts, and the claim was always that if nature is given room and reason, it moves toward perfection when held in a vessel that knows how to wait for it, as if the stone were time made visible. The laboratory doubled as chapel, and many texts insist that the stone is the mirror of an inner operation that travels through the blackness of dissolution, the whitening of clarity, the yellowing of dawning intuition, and the reddening of complete union. Stages of soul superimposed on stains in a crucible. Yet the same pages linger on technicalities. The dryness of a salt, the smell of a vapor, the precise pulse of heat during a long digestion, as if the secret could not decide which side of the glass to live on and kept a hand in both fires. After the Roman roads emptied and libraries dimmed, much of the craft slipped into monastery cells and wandering hands, ferrying itself through centuries in the quiet corners where vellum survived damp and warmth. forgetting by the ritual of copying letter for letter. With authority suspicious and famine common, anything that promised to multiply bread by brightening lead into wealth or healing beside the candle of prayer was soaked in risk and hope. So the knowledge bent into codes that turned recognizable steps into emblems, so that eyes could slide over them without understanding, while other eyes would stop and nod. There is the sound of a mortar and pestle like distant thunder, the smell of vinegar turned to sharp spirit, the faint green of a flame that ate copper, and the way a pale solution slowly darkened like an evening sky until flakes of metal fell like unseasonal snow. Apprentices learned to watch surfaces more than clocks, and neighbors learned to watch the alchemist much more than either, because a sudden ascent from poverty or a rumor of a yellow coin arriving from a black mass could turn curiosity to accusation in less time than a flask takes to cloud. Many authorities feared coinage debased more than transmutation proved, and so edicts and condemnations did not entirely kill the art, but pushed it into narrower vessels where language could not be easily prosecuted, while practice remained plausible. The stone survived this pressure by wearing another name, the medicine of the wise, the perfection of bodies, and in the shadow of illness it found protection, because a society can refuse gold in the name of order more easily than it can refuse healing in the name of purity. Among the oldest masters remembered is a figure called Maria the Jewess, credited with inventing the gentle double-boiler bath that still bears her name, and a multi-necked flask whose geometry allowed fractions of vapor to be separated like thoughts sorted by silence. These devices made it possible to coax out spirits hiding in common substances and to return them changed. And if the Philosopher's Stone exists at the end of a winding hallway, it is impossible not to notice that the hallway is lined with inventions that modern laboratories still consider home. Secrecy was not only an affectation. It was a survival strategy and a method of teaching, because the student who reads perfectly transparent instructions becomes a thief of technique without becoming a custodian of purpose. Thus the master wrote so that understanding would require transformation, because the lore held that greed breaks the stone and impatience burns it. And if the recipe could be transmitted without changing the hand that holds it, the world would fill with bright disasters that no authority could call back. They called it a seed that ferments, a tincture that spreads its color through metal like wine through linen, a leaven that makes the heavy body rise until what once resisted suddenly yields and takes on a softness that does not break. Chemists centuries later would name catalysts and discover substances that accelerate change without being consumed by it. And reading backward, the alchemical metaphors sound less like philosophy and more like a memory of something that behaves with uncanny economy in the dark. The lore speaks of philosophical mercury, a term all but impossible to introduce to the mind without confusing it with the quicksilver that crawls over a tabletop in shining beads. And yet the alchemists insisted that the mercury they sought was a principle, not a puddle, something extracted from many seeds by parity rather than from the obvious metal by force. Finding it meant finding the trick of loosening matter into its most sympathetic form, a solvent that is also a mother, and to do that they reached and not infrequently wandered. Somewhere in the drifting light of late antiquity, the thread turned east and south, and the old corpus passed through the hands of Syriac translators into Arabic libraries, where scholars with patient habits and imperial patronage tore it apart and rebuilt it with scales and furnaces that did not forgive wishful thinking. In that translation movement, the stone began to acquire sharper edges, its pages filled with measurable procedures that sounded like prophecies filtered through glass. And it is there that the next layer of the mystery begins to glow. The old world dimmed and another lit up along the Tigris, and in the new light, the stone learned to speak numbers and reagents with a tongue that tasted of vinegar and flame. And it is into that city of copper and night that the trail now bends. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, the language of philosophy crossed with the language of fire, and a scholar called Jābir by the Latins, Jābir ibn Kayyan by his own, gathered texts and experiments into a body of work that felt less like a bookshelf and more like a world with its own gravity. He and those who wrote under his name proposed that metals were composed of principles resembling sulfur and mercury, dry and moist, combustible and flowing, and by balancing these could shift a dull metal toward the perfection of gold, a theory daring enough to invite both furnaces and prayers. The Jābirian corpus turned the vagueness of myths into ratios, and the enterprise gained a geometry of equilibrium that demanded scales as faithful as scripture and patience sharper than steel, because a single measure too much of heat or acid could turn the vessel into an empty confession. It was a dream of a universe that responds to proportion, and if a recipe in the guise of a riddle could carry through time, then numbers might be the knots that hold the rope, and several knots now began to pull. From their hands came the refinement of apparatus that caught and condensed breathings few had seen so clearly. Alembics drawing spirits from wine and vinegar, retorts that withheld and released according to the art of angles, and red oils coaxed from green crystals that hissed like serpents when they met metals in the bowl. They learned to bite copper with sharpened liquids, to open silver with aquafortis, to dissolve gold itself in a regal mix of spirits, and to watch what precipitated back from solution with a care that could not help wondering whether the stone was a mastery of appetite as much as substance. Those halls were filled with mathematics and medicine as well as metallurgy, and cross-pollination gave rise to treatises that braided astronomy, optics, and chemistry into a language where experiment rejoined cosmology without embarrassment. The anonymous philosophers of the links of purity imagined a brotherhood of knowledge in which the stone became less an object than a process of aligning all things with their essence until they mirrored the arithmetic of the heavens. And it was a short imagination from there to seeing the stone as the hinge of a larger architecture. Through Muslim Spain, the river of books flowed into Latin, and in Toledo and other cities, translators pulled Arabic sentences into tongues that monasteries could digest, widening the circle of hands that could light a furnace at midnight in the shadow of a cloister. With translation came misattribution and reinvention, and soon the West spoke of Geber, a Latinized phantom author whose works on perfection and calcination stitched Arabic precision to medieval hunger, pulling practical chemistry deeper into an allegory it refused to forget. The Latin texts built a scaffolding of methods, purifying sulfur, subliming mercury with salts, extracting spirits from vitriol until the metal's own body wept its strongest breath, and baking substances so long that color itself seemed to char and resurrect. Cathedral builders heaved stone into roses and labyrinths as these works took shape, and it became a temptation to see in stained glass the color sequence of inner fire, and in the spiral of a nave the path of a serpent through its own coils, inviting pilgrims to read while walking. Chrysopoeia, the making of gold, was both a goal and a lure, and the literature shivered with emblems that seemed to offer maps, and then turned into mirrors when followed too literally, as if the authors feared the literal reader more than the unimaginative one. Animal fables led to procedures and back again. A fox meant arsenic, a toad a mineral poison, a dragon a corrosive spirit, and everywhere color changes were love stories under Hermetic suns, telling the hands what the mind could not be trusted to enact. Kings and princes found the science convenient to fund when war expenses rose and minds fell quiet, and the laboratories moved into castles, where failure could be house arrest and success could be a throne's intoxication. In such places, the alchemist learned discretion, not only about recipes, but about expectations, and many texts grew stern about the need for purity of motive, warning that the stone would not reveal itself to hands that squeezed too tightly, which is a complicated principle to explain in a ledger balanced in a palace. In the late medieval mind, a new name appears, Basil Valentine, under whose name treatises on antimony and the starry patterns of a metallic regulus guide the eye toward transformations that look like ice forming in steel, a metal changing its lattice into something tentatively celestial. The association of the stone with a starry metal tied earth to sky in measurable crystals, and in the white sparkled surface of antimony, you may glimpse the way an earthly pattern can resemble the heavens without asking permission. The Ripley Scrolls unwind like long banners of dream, their parchment populated with a king in a bath, a hermaphrodite crowned, serpents intertwined, and wheels of colors turning like the seasons in an orchard of hourglasses. Some read them and see a poem. Others read them and find instruction hiding in illustrations of plants and beasts, timing hidden in the growth rings of trees, and proportions encoded in the length of a serpent's arc, which is a strange way to measure. And yet, this is a strange apprenticeship. Monasteries and townhouses sprouted small furnaces and glass tubes, and at night the alchemist watched drops become rivulets, and rivulets become fog, and fog become rain again inside the belly of glass, as if weather had been invited indoors and told to speak. The word vitriol grew a second life as a motto, for descent into the earth to find what purifies and descends again. And some of that descent was literal, into mines and caves to gather blue-green crystals, and the salts of old seas bound up in stone that tasted like a secret turned sour. Penalties for fraud were high, but sponsorship for knowledge was higher in certain seasons, and the church's relationship to this world of fire and symbol was more complicated than a tale of blanket forbiddance allows. Bishops sought medicines. Abbots saw in the metaphors a spiritual curriculum. The dangerous edge was counterfeiting coin, not distilling a spirit of salt that might cure a fever, and thus the line between forbiddens and permitted turned into a hedge the careful could pass through with the right wording and the right silence. Alchemical emblems of weddings and births grew more explicit, describing the union of a red king and white queen through the mediation of a salt that reconciles their natures, a sexualized metaphor intended to anchor procedures as well as to resist the dryness of abstraction. In the bed of the flask, metals married and died and returned, and each cycle pushed a silver hope toward a rubified certainty. And at that conflux, the stone began to feel less like a miracle and more like a technique disguised for its own protection. The metaphor of fermentation took hold with force, insisting that a tiny amount of the stone could insinuate itself into a mass of metal and teach it to ripen, like a sourdough starter that turns a bowl of flour toward bread by offering its own living pattern. If this ferment is real, then it must be grown from a mother that already knows how to be what it asks others to become. And that mother is the great question that every hand returns to, with a mixture of faith and cunning. In Paris, the legend gathered around a modest scribe, Nicholas Flamel, who by tale found a book of strange signs, puzzled his way into its heart, and then quietly poured wealth into churches and hospices, as if transmutation were only meaningful when it passed anonymously back into the world. Records of donations exist. Records of a red stone do not, and between those two truths, the legend persists like a faint warmth in winter stone, a rumor that keeps scholars in archives and late wanderers peering at carved angels as if letters might be hidden in their wings. The path spreads now across Europe, into German forests and Italian studies, and through the doors of imperial courts where patience and danger cook side by side because the promise refuses to declare itself finished, and the stone remains tucked somewhere between furnace and fable, inviting the next hand to reach again. The trail of Nicholas Flamel leads through the registers of Parisian property and charity, where a scribe's name anchors money to masonry, and through a tombstone whose carved symbols became a magnet for those who wanted to see in every vine a serpent and in every star a recipe. Art historians point to conventional motifs shared by guilds and parishes. Lithographers point to hidden alphabets of the craft, and between them, the image refuses to sit still, flickering like a flame on a windy night that seems to promise more if you'll just keep watching. The story of a pilgrimage to a shrine on the Spanish road surfaced generations after his death, in which a meeting with a learned stranger unlocked a code that Paris could not unlock alone, creating a chain of places that suggests the stone prefers to be found not at home, but in motion. Whatever the truth of the tale, the pilgrimage archetype fits the work too well to ignore, for the craft is told again and again as a crossing that changes the one who crosses, a structure that feels more like a rite than a shortcut and entices for that reason. To the east, in Bohemia, an emperor gathered wonders like a dragon hoarding sunbeams, filling Prague with artists, instrument makers, astronomers, and alchemists whose laboratories were as much theaters as factories. Under Rudolf II, the hope of Chrysopoeia was not an embarrassment, but an imperial goal, and alongside mechanical automata and cabinets of curiosities, furnaces glowed as if the city itself had become a single elaborate apparatus quietly trying to persuade matter to agree with imagination. In that city, an English mathematician obsessed with angels and a scryer with a missing ear passed through, leaving behind journals of visions and a wake of suspicion and wonder that has not settled. Another Englishman, Edward Kelly, displayed a red powder that performed in crucibles with uncanny conviction in front of those who had a king's stake in success, and in that cloud of witnesses, the line between trick and breakthrough blurs so thoroughly that it becomes its own kind of riddle. If belief can make wealth, what can wealth make belief do? Not far from those passages, a Polish nobleman with a melter's hands and a mind tuned to air and salt wrote about a spirit that nourishes fire and life, bound up in niter and in the air itself, articulating a universal presence that later science would call something else and measure with other tools. He wrote of a seed of the stone, and of a food of metals that seemed more like a latent breath than a thing. And the suggestion is unnerving, that the stone might be a way of distributing the world's secret food into starved places. Heinrich Kunrath etched an amphitheater of the wise that looks like a cathedral melted into a laboratory, an image arguing that architecture itself can become an instrument, and that the placement of a furnace within a circle and a text within a nave matters as concretely as the placement of a crucible within a bath. If space could be chosen to help a reaction complete itself, perhaps it is because the reaction belongs to a choreography beyond the invisible, and this suspicion turns every column into a possible tool. Around that time, pamphlets appeared declaring a fraternity of the Rose Cross that knew the secrets of medicine and alchemy and intended to reform the world by folding hidden knowledge into public improvement, a promise of invisible colleges and an ethic of service that sounded like a flare thrown into a dark sky. Scholars argue over hoax and hope. Adepts smile and speak of misdirection. And through the debate, the craft earns a new mask and perhaps a new vow that the stone is not for vaults, but for healing a wound that is older than coin. The color work matured into a psychology of matter. The negredo marked by decay like fertile soil, the albedo by washing and clarity like winter light, the citronitis by dawning yellow like the promise before sunrise, and the rubedo by the deep red of completion like coals that are more living than flames. Even as the allegory deepened, practitioners kept their hands in practical brine, because it is difficult to sustain metaphor unless the flask answers sometimes, and the reports of color shifts in jars often sound like liturgy enacted on a tongue of glass. In an English study facing an orchard, a scholar whose name would later become synonymous with a clockwork universe filled more pages with alchemy than with the calculus of planets, copying recipes from a mysterious adept who called himself a lover of truth, and hoping to crack the preparation of a mercurial agent that many texts granted pride of place. The manuscripts smell of iron and ink and long nights, and the notes show a mind as relentless before a retort as before a prism. A unity of method more striking than the division of subject suggests. He chased the starry regulus made from antimony and iron, the purging of its dross with saltpeter, so that it ran clear and held a pattern of snowflakes. A metallurgical poem that, some promised, could be married to a purged mercury to give birth to a child capable of teaching lead to remember its forgotten royalty. The phrases are both absurd and precise, floating between worlds like a bridge of mist and steel. And in them is a craft that seems to demand a heart trained to live with paradox, without letting the hand lose its balance. Networks of correspondence connected such minds, sometimes with ciphers, and sometimes with an anonymity that only deepens the enigma. A web of furnaces and letters through which observational rigor and visionary assent traded favors. It becomes difficult to tell where modern science steps away from alchemy and where it grows directly out of it. And that ambiguity is the most telling chemistry of all, because disciplines do not announce themselves at their births. They are named later by those who need names. Books without words appeared, like the Mutus Liber, where a sequence of plates show a garden, a dew-gathering cloth stretched over grass, vessels set under mourning, and a series of unspoken actions that carry the work forward without a sentence to anchor them. It is exasperating and consoling by turns, promising that if you have eyes to see, you will see, and if you do not, no dictionary can save you, and perhaps that is merciful in a field that cannot afford to multiply pretenders. The countryside and the city both joined in the hush of the athanor, where iron, vitriol, wine, urine, soot, and starry crystals shared space with prayers and recipes for oils that burn without flame, and the practice started to accumulate small, private miracles that cannot be footnoted. Some swore they saw, after a month of gentle warmth, a rosy crust form on a white mass that refused to melt before it tinted a grain of tin unnaturally bright, while others watched the same combination of agents fall inert year after year, and such contradictions drive either wonder or ruin. Stories entered print and were remembered. A Dutch physician approached by a stranger with a powder that turned a portion of his metal to gold. A lawyer seeing the same in a spoon. A populace leaning forward to see into a crucible that was never really theirs to see into. Even if such demonstrations were tricks, their persistence stokes a fire under the question, because the rumor of fire warms a room, even when nothing visible is burning, and in that warmth, curiosity grows roots. When the English scholar died, his heirs and biographers built a monument to reason that left certain trunks closed, and the alchemical notes fell into private hands where they remained, a quiet counterpoint to the public image that would stand for a century. Behind that monument, the papers kept smoldering, and it would take another age, and a poet-economist with a sense for heresy, to lift the lid and let the smoke back into the story that had pretended to no longer need it. Yet the intervening air was not empty. It was thick with unlooked-for clues and unmeasured continuities that would surface under unfamiliar names when the next century turned its attention to the inner laboratory that shared a wall with the outer one. In an office lined with images of kings dissolved and reconstituted as birds, a physician of souls began to read the old books as if they were dreams lying across centuries, finding in their metallic marriages and putrefactions the symptoms of a psyche laboring toward wholeness. He understood the stone as an image of the self, the unifying center around which fragments orbit until meaning holds. And in doing so, he offered a way to preserve the alchemical corpus that did not depend on a single successful casting of a golden bead, which is itself a kind of medicine. Dreams of explorers, artisans, and ordinary people began to show the same serpents and vessels, and the analyst's room became a retort of images distilling private stories into collective patterns, so that the stone became the name for the moment when a life no longer leaks at its seams. This reframing did not empty the laboratory of its tools. It reframed them as extensions of inner work, and a generation grew comfortable thinking of distillations as clarities and coagulations, as commitments that hold when the day grows hot. But centuries before, a physician who had roamed battlefields had already called for alchemy to attend to the body as much as the vault, reclaiming the art as a discipline of medicines extracted from plants and minerals and dosed with care to reverse the imbalance of humors and spirits. In this spagyric approach, separation and reunion are enacted to remove poisons and intensify virtues, and the promise of a stone that cures all becomes less a fantasy and more a radical hope that the right preparation could teach the body to remember its design. Antimony, the gray semi-metal, under Basil Valentine's constant attention, became both a demon and an angel of medicine because it purged with terrifying effectiveness and poisoned with the same zeal, forcing practitioners to learn the difference between cure and harm with a severity that could not flatter ignorance. The careful refining of antimony into forms less acutely dangerous resembled a moral discipline as well as a chemical one, as if the metal demanded ethics be weighed in the same scales as salts. Slowly, measures appeared that could keep minds honest. A gas noted by Van Helmont as a peculiar spirit that escapes burning wood and fermenting must. Balance is measured by weight rather than persuasion, and a skeptical temper that insisted that claims be tested by trials rather than by clever argument. The Boyle who spoke with courtesy and exactness forced alchemy to restate its case in terms that could be observed and repeated, and as this insistence grew, the stone did not disappear. It became a narrower target, illuminated by brighter lamps. From a city workshop, a glow-in-the-dark wonder crawled into history when it went. Berlin alchemist coaxed a luminous substance from 1,000 liters of urine, a brutal economy that produced the first isolated element, never seen before by the naked eye as itself. Phosphorus looked as if someone had poured starlight into a jar and taught it to burn coldly. And this pure marvel proved that alchemists sometimes reached into darkness and drew out a piece of the periodic table under another name without knowing the table existed yet. The dream of a universal solvent never left the literature, either as a corrosive liquid that could break the stubborn bonds of stubborn substances, or as a more abstract capacity to dissolve resistances wherever they arise and reconstitute them in a more harmonious pattern. Every acid can be abused, and every metaphor can be stretched until it thins and breaks. And the idea of an alchemist sits in the balance between those two facts, becoming at once a warning and a lure, because the mind craves something that can solve everything, even as glass must refuse it to survive. Reports circulated that a stone, once obtained in a small quantity, could be multiplied by feeding it metal, that it increased not by harvest from outside, but by teaching new matter to be like itself, a repetition of the ancient yeast image that chemistry would later convert into reaction kinetics and surface catalysis. The fermentation metaphor is both practical and mystical, pointing to self-organization as an engine invited rather than forced. And if this is true, then the stone resembles a cultural insight more than a mineral. It spreads because it resonates. Nature revealed her own power to transmute when, in laboratories far from furnaces, the discovery of radioactivity overturned the age-old assumption that elements were fixed, a revolution that changed everything while leaving the practical pursuit of cheap gold as impossible as ever. Particle accelerators would eventually nudge mercury into gold in quantities too tiny and too expensive to matter. And this melancholy fact somehow comforts the myth, because it ensures that the desire for wealth cannot be the final owner of the stone, even if it tries to be. The sense that knowledge had been hidden not only by difficulty, but by intent swelled in some quarters, which imagined vaults under palaces and monasteries where retorts still breathed, guarded by families and orders that had made peace with silence. Thales pointed to coated floors and windows in great cathedrals, to labyrinths intended for the faithful that might also be intended for the patient reader, whose feet could trace sentences while their lips recited prayers, a double language that invites as it eludes. In the 20th century, the trunks of the English alchemists' papers opened to scholars, and an economist who loved imagination as much as markets declared that the great physicist was as much a magician as a mechanist, restoring the firelight to a portrait that had been painted with daylight alone. This reopening did not so much shift science backward as it unfolded its roots into a soil shared with older trees, and the stone regained a certain legitimacy as a problem one could think and feel, rather than an embarrassment to be footnoted away. Those who read closely began to reconstruct procedures that sound less impossible than urgent and fiercely specific, in which the starry metal antimony is rendered pure with iron and saltpeter, its crystalline beauty married to a carefully prepared mercury, whose life in the flask behaves unlike any metallic droplet elsewhere. The notion of a philosophical mercury ceased to be a mere conceit and became a project that blurred the line between metallurgy and alchemy without quite erasing it, and the stone returned to the bench in whispers. The descriptions of the work that survive best are maddeningly patient. Weeks of calcination under a heat barely more than a hand's warmth. Artesian waters gathered at dawn and salted. Products repeatedly dissolved and recombined until the colors settle into an order that is part chemistry and part ritual. If the stone exists, it seems to require a temperament that is hard to scale. And in a culture of speed, this is either its last protection or its final disappearance, because the world rarely waits for those who refuse to hurry. And yet, in scattered basements and mountain cabins and urban laboratories, wedged between jobs and obligations, the work flickers on, more private than a church, and more communal than a reputation, tending the union of the dry and the moist, the fiery and the mild, the fixed and the volatile. Between chemical novelty and contemplative discipline, there is a narrow path, and footsteps continue to polish it, leaving behind a polish that others might notice without recognizing the road until they realize they have already been walking it. The question has grown larger rather than smaller, stretching to fit both test tubes and dream journals, and it leans toward a present that must decide whether to inherit it as fable, as method, or as something that refuses to split along those lines and asks instead for a patience that feels like faith. The philosopher's stone now lives at a crossroads, where a red powder and a red dawn keep exchanging places, a tangible catalyst that whispers to metals and a compass that whispers to minds, each promising to bring the other into alignment with a pattern older than the names we give it. If the world allows such a double existence, then the stone is not an outlier, but a reminder that matter and meaning have been sharing a table all along, and we have only just remembered to sit down without insisting on a wall between plates. Descriptions of the work outline a cadence rather than a trick, a sequence of transformations that repeats across texts like a litany. Burn the superfluous until only bone ash remains. Soften the ash in a sea of dissolution. Pull apart what clings. Reunite what belongs with what it has learned. Feed the new body so that it wakes to its own hunger. Raise its spirit and return it richer, and bring the whole to rest in a substance that does not fall apart when heated by the world. Each step is small enough to be misunderstood and large enough to become a life if followed to its edge. The old motto that sends the seeker into the earth to rectify and find the hidden stone looks practical when read beside a miner's kit and a chemist's shelf, because iron vitriol, copper salts, cave seepage, and the salts of morning dew are not metaphors until a hand has gathered them and found that they behave like letters forming a phrase. The earth's interior speaks in crystals and stains, and the practitioner who learns that grammar gains a sulfurous library whose pages can only be turned by heat and patience, which is its own kind of reading. Modern chemistry adds accents to the poem by showing how gold-tinted glass owes its ruby to nanoparticles whose presence was once an accident of tradition and trial, a discovery that retroactively explains the ancient glow of stained windows that alchemists love to count as messages. If artisans were unwitting nanotechnologists, then the stone's myth overlaps with a history of color and light, teaching that a pigment can be a philosophy when it holds its brightness in a way that no other matter quite knows how to manage. In a crucible where antimony melts with iron and purges itself with saltpeter, a star field appears on the cooling metal, a frostwork that looks like the sky stopped by a breath and given to a hand to hold. Adepts read such patterns as confirmations that the metal has been taught to listen to its own nature. And whether or not this projection is true, the stars whet curiosity until the next operation feels less like an experiment and more like a continuation of a conversation, interrupted only by sleep. If the stone is a ferment, then the repeated solution and coagulation of matter nod toward the way crystals learn to arrange themselves when given time and seed, and the flask becomes an orchard where stones are encouraged to grow like fruit that ripens from hard to yielding. The gardener's patience suits the retort because terrible accidents come to those who dig up roots to check for progress. And this gentle discipline might be the strangest teaching of all in an art that the world prefers to imagine as a lightning strike. If the stone is a figure for inner integration, then the laboratory takes its place among the disciplines that teach centering by insisting on a patience that has no short path, and red is less a color achieved in a crucible than the glow of having survived one's own deconstruction without bitterness. The union of opposites ceases to be a metaphor and becomes a habit, the moment in which the fixed can finally welcome the volatile without trying to kill it, which is a skill as valuable in the soul as in the vessel. The libraries that hold the long scrolls and the abbreviated emblems do not give up their treasures to the casual passerby, but to the reader who returns after failure and finds that the same image offers a different instruction when seen with altered eyes, like a mirror that changes not itself, but what it reflects. Perhaps this is what the adepts meant when they said the books were sealed, not by locks, but by the requirement that the reader be altered before the reading makes sense, which is an unusual requirement and a useful one. Somewhere a quiet figure is warming a sand bath with a flame as small as a moth's body, checking the glass not for quantities, but for a color that has learned to deepen through its own obedience to gravity and fire. And the room feels less like a workshop than a cell in a monastery that never quite gave up on the world. On a shelf, there is a jar of dew gathered before the sun rose in May, a salt made by evaporating the season itself, and it waits like a letter that the air wrote to the earth and asked the alchemist to carry to the next step. The question returns as softly as it began: myth or hidden alchemy, parable or process, dream that heals or powder that stains everything with gold until it cannot go back to dullness again. The answer that refuses to disappoint is that the stone has always been both, and never one without the other. A double path where technique without meaning turns to ashes, and meaning without technique vanishes into talk, which invites a seeker to choose not a destination, but a way of walking that will show the horizon as it shifts. If there is a secret, it may not be a sentence but a rhythm, a way that time is held, and heat is measured and waiting is practiced, until stubborn bonds concede and new bonds solidify in a beauty that can be tested both in a metal and in a day. That rhythm cannot be purchased and cannot be stolen, and that is why the stone has survived its own prey, because it arranges conditions under which it prefers to appear, rather than forcing itself into hands that do not yet know how to hold it without breaking it. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.